Jim wanted me to mention to all of you that he didn't mention in the announcements that I did my quarterly report. The elders asked that I provide a quarterly report of everything that I've been up to. So you know what I'm doing, and I leave a copy of that out on the table. So if you're having trouble falling asleep tonight, grab one of those on the way out, and it might help you. But if you ever have questions about it, it's kind of just bullet points of what I've been up to, but the stories of what's going on and what God's been doing are a lot better than just the bullet points. So come ask me if you ever have any questions. With that being said, let's jump into things today. Thank you so much for being back this week as we start our second week of the Fundamentals of the Faith series. Last week we looked at Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul tells us that the core of Christianity is about Jesus' resurrection. Today we're going to be building on this, but in order to build on this, we also have to go back at the same time, because the big question is, okay, so why did Jesus have to come? Why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus have to be raised from the dead? And the answer has to do with this strange word we call worship. Now, worship is one of those words we don't use very often in our culture, in our society today. It's a church word. In fact, we're going to be going over a bunch of church words. We often say them in church, but in everyday practice, we don't say them as much. So when we hear worship, we typically think of a worship service, which you are sitting in right now. Hope you know you're in the right place with that. Or worship music, the genre of music. And while these things are good, it's just scratching the surface of what worship really is. So I'm going to seek today to flesh out this word, because our culture may not use the word worship very often, but we use worship words, and we worship so often we don't realize we're doing this. So consider this. What is the largest worship gathering in our state? Hint. It happens every Sunday in the fall. Broncos games, where over 75,000 people gather around. And if you listen to pre or post game talk about sports, notice that they often use worship words. Well, that quarterback is so amazing. They don't say that about Broncos quarterbacks, but he can throw the ball so well. This guy can catch. Can you see how fast he is? Can you see how strong he is? And all these terms that they're using are words of worship. Let's consider another genre, the arts. Award ceremonies where you gather together the actors and singers and they worship them for all their amazing talents. They gather together in fancy clothes. And the Oscars, if you ever watch, is basically a time where they use all these adjectives that describes various forms of worship, and occasionally they smack each other. But nothing is more revealing than the ways we worship today than our modern marketing. Our marketers are so good at convincing us to buy something. They use not only incredible words, but images and videos to show us how in these products we need to make something better. I remember showing this to my kids the first time when they had to deal with commercials on regular television. They thought they were terrible, and then they were asking to buy everything in the commercials, right? You ever been there before? And so when this happens, nothing will satisfy us. When we have to have something, when the greed in our heart is, I need to buy this thing, we are sold on it. We are worshiping that item because we desire it so greatly. So today we're going to talk about worship and all the ways us as humans continue to worship. Mostly we'll be looking at the consequences of worship and what happens to us and the problem of worship. But we're going to start also unpacking the solution of worship today. But more on this in following weeks as this series builds on itself. So pray with me as we get started. God, we come before you this morning to call you our God. I pray that your Spirit would convict our hearts of all the ways we worship. I pray that your Spirit would also build in us a greater desire for a greater form of worship. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear how we as human beings are created to worship and a better way to live and a better way to worship. To that end, pour through me the gift of preaching, that Christ may be formed in hearts. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So I need to take you to the Old Testament this morning, to the first book of the Bible, Genesis. In Genesis, God promises these people called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he's going to make their descendants into a great nation. This promise keeps repeating. And so their descendants grow into this large group of people while in slavery in Egypt. And God miraculously sets them free in this thing called the 10 plagues. Now, the 10 plagues, we get too obsessed when we teach it in Bible class. We start talking about the nature of the plagues. But there's something bigger going on with the 10 plagues. See, each one of the 10 plagues represents one of the gods of Egypt. So God, through the 10 plagues, is systematically dismantling all the gods of Egypt. And he sets these people free. He sets them free, and Pharaoh's army charges in, and he parts the sea. They part through this, and they come out, and they are trying to be a nation. So God leads them with this fireball and this cloud to Mount Sinai to build them, these millions of people, into a nation. So Moses climbs up on the mountain to meet with God, and God delivers him these 10 commandments, these rules of what it looks like to have a leader, to start to live as a people group. And so the very first one is, you shall have no other gods before me. If you were to read through the 10 commandments, really the first 4 are all about this, not having other gods. And the irony of the situation is, while God's delivering this to Moses, Aaron's down there making a golden calf, and they're worshiping idols. Okay? It's like he can't even get through making the list before the problem has started. Any parents can relate to that issue, maybe? And so, what's so crazy is they've witnessed all these plagues. They realized as they plundered Egypt, as they gave them the gold, they saw God part the sea, the fireball, the manna, the dew in the morning, all these things. And then they would have the audacity to say, yeah, but where's God now? I mean, let's just go ahead and make our own idol. Let's make a golden calf. Where is God? And we are tempted to think, this is so silly. How could you ever fall for this? And that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, why do we continue to fall for the same thing? Why do we, in our inconveniences in our lives, in our times of loneliness, start to make these idols for ourselves when there is a better way to live? So Israel has this pattern. If you read through the Old Testament, it happens. It's this cycle over and over again. We studied a glimpse of this in Bible class today as we looked at the book of Judges. Israel will have these times where they are faithful to God, where they follow God's commands. And when that happens, they flourish. Things are great. And then they will have these times and these seasons where they start worshiping idols. They start worshiping other gods. And God says, okay, that's the choice you've made. Let's see how those gods can provide for you. And every time it is a disaster. It is a train wreck when that happens. And when we see this, when we read these ancient stories and we're like, what do you mean they carved these wooden images, or they made something out of gold or silver and they worship these things? It's so silly. How could they ever do that? And I want to stop for a second and just talk about what worship is, because I think it's helpful as we unpack what they were doing and what we might be tempted to do as well. See, worship is giving the adoration in your heart to something. You worship what you value, what you love, what you care about. Worship is the affection of your heart to what you truly care about. And so when modern readers read the Old Testament and we hear all the things they're worshiping of these weird, crazy pagan gods around ancient Israel, it can be really silly to us. Like, are you really going to worship a statue? However, what we don't see is how deeply practical it was to them. See, the ancient people around Israel would have had household gods that they believed helped them with things like fertility for themselves and their livestock. They believed that it helped them with safety at night. It helped them in battle. They believed these gods would bring them rain or make the grass green or protect them from predators. So before we start judging them, we need to realize that we have grown men in this state who still believe in the Colorado Rockies. I mean, what is going on there? But what these ancient people worshiped can help us see these practical things, help us see what we put our faith in. See, we can put our faith in technology, which is great until it isn't, right? If you see Brian, Stephen, Hal, and I huddled up in the corner back there, you know something has happened to technology and we were trying to fix it. We had a little Easter incident last Sunday and Hal got us through it, right? We work through those things. Consider our culture knowledge. How much we like knowledge. Post-Enlightenment, we love to think of ourselves as being so smart. We actually can have this pride of how smart we are until we get humbled and we realize that we actually don't know everything or how much we actually have to learn. Do you know that this desire for God-like knowledge is actually the first sin? In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, the first people, are sitting there in the garden, and the reason they ate from the tree wasn't for the fruit. Traditionally, we don't know what fruit it was. Traditionally, it was depicted as an apple, a red delicious apple. Now, I don't know why a red delicious has that name, because there is nothing delicious about a red delicious if you've ever had that variety of apple. It is grainy, it is awful, it does not taste very well. My in-laws are here, they have experience with orchard, they've exposed me to other types of apples, and let me tell you, if it would have been a Granny Smith, it would have been tempting to me, right? But it wasn't for the apple. So why did Adam and Eve eat from the tree? To be like God. And this leads us to another church word. It's the concept, or it's this word and term we use called free will. In the center of the garden is this tree that is the ultimate metaphor of free will. This tree that is growing out, and God says, you can eat from everything else, but not that one. And we love to come down really hard as Christians on Adam and Eve, like, thanks for getting us in this situation. But we don't consider how many days did Adam and Eve walk with God in the garden before they ate from the tree? How many days were perfect? How many days were paradise? How many days did they use their free will and say, you know what, God told us not to eat from it? And so their actions were, we're going to use our free will to trust that God is God and we are humans, and we're going to abstain from that simply because God told us to. In fact, it wasn't until the evil one showed up in a serpent to deceive them to thinking there was another way in life. And that is the core of what I'm getting at today. We can be tempted to think that all these things in life, all these things are really good for us. They're really good things. When in fact, when we place them at too high of a level, they're actually really damaging for us. Actually, all these modern examples that I'll go through today of idols, in them of themselves, aren't necessarily bad things at their core. They're actually a blessing from God, but it's when we get them out of order that they become an issue. We want to keep our loves straight. And when we deceive ourselves into believing that these other things are our source of life, that's when they become an idol for us. When in fact, truly all they are is benefits from the real source of life. So let me give you a really practical example of getting our loves out of order. My grandfather had this phrase that he would say over and over again. You may have heard it before. Many people his generation would say it. He would express the order of his loves. He would say it like this: God, family, country. And he would be really quick to point out the order. The order is God, the second is family, the third is country. Anyone ever heard someone say something like this before? And so I want to use this as a little case study for what idols might be like in our life, what it might look like to get our loves out of order. So the first is family. How could we get that love out of order? Well, consider what many romantic songs you hear on the radio are like. They're love songs worshiping someone, if you really get down to it. Or what about romantic movies? If you watch those and you look carefully, sometimes it exaggerates the role of a romantic relationship in our lives. In 1996, the movie came out with Jerry Maguire. And there's this point where Tom Cruise tells the woman that he loves this line that is the climax of the movie: "You complete me." And oh man, when we're all in that honeymoon stage of our marriage, when it's the infatuation stage, you're like, this person completes me. And then those that have been married for a while realize, no, they don't complete you. And that's when you have a decision to make. Because there's holes in our heart, there's space inside of us that only God can fill. And so we can let God come in those moments and start to fill those spaces, or we can start looking for other gods to come in and fill those spaces. We have a decision to make. Or let's think of another example: children. Children are one of the greatest blessings God gives us. But now we have a phrase for parents who get their loves out of order, who give up everything, sacrifice everything for these children. We call them helicopter parents, right? You can hear them hovering as they come in to protect their kids. So, what about the last thing on this list? Country. What does that look like? See, patriotism can be a great thing. Being thankful for our country, the country we live in, wanting to make our country a better place, all really, really good stuff. The temptation is to think that our country is better than any other country, to overvalue our country, to seek to dominate or overcome other countries, to extract their resources for our own need. In extreme cases, this can lead to things like dictatorships, like trying to conquer the world, genocide, Exhibit A, Nazi Germany, with all these kind of things. And so when we get our loves out of order, how do we fix it? What does this look like? Well, each person has to decide for themselves how they are going to recover from this mistake or these issues that they have in their life. It's a two-step process, and the first one is realizing that you have a problem. This is where our brothers and sisters who have overcome the idol of substance abuse are such a benefit for us. They can be such a blessing. Alcoholics Anonymous is famous for this because the first step in being an alcoholic in Alcoholics Anonymous is admitting you have a problem. You have to say it. See, they are under no illusion of their own self-righteousness. They know they are guilty. And so the church word we use for this, when a mistake happens, is called sin. Now, sin is another word we don't use very often in our culture. We use it to describe really, really good desserts or like a place called Las Vegas. We don't talk about sin very much. But today, especially people who aren't Christians, and some Christians as well, don't like being called sinners. I don't know if you've come across this. I realized this walking out of Bronco games at the old Mile High Stadium. We'd go from the old Mile High Stadium with my family, and we had a long walk to where we parked. And every single time we would walk, leaving the game to where we parked, there would be Bullhorn Man. Any of you ever encountered a Bullhorn Man? He'd be standing up on his box, he'd have his bullhorn, and he'd be preaching brimstone and fire. He'd be condemning everyone to hell, not just the Raiders fans. And that was always confusing to me. And it didn't feel very good. So I want to unpack a little bit, what is sin and how do we address it? See, it's not just the way he was confronting people's sin that it was all off-putting. It's just the fact of coming to the conclusion that we are sinners. So I think there's a better way to understand this. See, the Greek word for sin is actually hamartia, is the name for it. And here's where things get cool. It's actually an archery term. So in order to explain sin, I need to explain a target to you as well. You know, a target, you're aiming for the center of the target. You're aiming for what we might describe as the bull's eye, to hit in the center of the target. So the literal translation in Greek for sin is missing the mark, is not hitting the bullseye, is not getting your aim correctly and hitting what you are aiming for. Are you starting to get a picture of what's going on here? Now, on a larger scale, when we miss the mark in life, it hurts us, it hurts our own life, it has consequences for our own lives, but it starts hurting others. This is part of what we also talked about in Bible class today, is this compounding effect of sin where we're all hurting each other. What do we do about it? It's messing up, it's making us a mistake, and it's a really serious issue. And how do we address it? Well, for a long time, we like to be like Bullhorn Man. We like to do, get that finger going. But instead of waving a finger, I think sometimes it's putting an arm around the shoulder. Say, man, I've been there before. I know one man that just, every time there was anyone ever with an affair, he'd be the one to take him out. And he'd talk about his list of adultery and the sins that he'd make. He'd just confess to the person. He said, here are my sins. What are yours? And I think it's our approach that's been off-putting in recent years, not only to the non-Christians, but people in our churches as well. But in this process of turning from our idols and turning to God, everyone has to come to their own conclusion that they're a sinner. And newsflash, it's not the people who usually commit the big sins that are like, I'm not a sinner. I'm telling you, I've been to the prisons. I've been there when the husband was caught in adultery. I've been there when the person is dealing with has been on a bender and is overcoming their alcoholism. I've been in those moments, and none of them have ever gone, oh, I'm not a sinner. No, they're sitting there at rock bottom and go, I am completely broken. Who is it that doesn't admit that they're sinners? Us. The people who kind of think we have our life on track. That things seem to be going pretty well for us, both us in the church and outside of the church. We're like, no. Do you see how I'm doing? Do you see, I'm taking care of all these things in life. I've got things in order. And no, we have to at some point say, I am broken. I need to fix some things. And so sometimes I wonder if we should start church off by going around and just everyone saying and introducing ourselves, hello, my name's Tyler, and I'm a sinner. I wonder if that would get us in the right focus so we're not worried about any self-righteousness or any illusion of how great we are, but that we can come in and worship someone greater in those moments. So after one admits they have a sin problem, there's an issue going on inside of them that is they're worshiping something that isn't God. What's the second step? Well, there's more involved in this one, but the fancy church word we use for this is called atonement. God is so perfect and we can be so sinful. The question is, how do we ever atone for these things? How do we ever reconcile the difference? In our world today, we make all kinds of atonements. Generally, in America, we have two forms of atonement. When we make a mistake, when we break a law, we atone by either losing our freedom or our finances. Right? We're either going to go to jail for a while or we are going to pay financially for something that happened. We actually have three synonyms we often use for atonement in our society. They're the three R's: reconciliation, retribution, and reparations. And the question is, how do we do this with God? How do we ever get right with God? Well, in the Old Testament, it was all about sacrifice and rituals to get right with God. They were under what Christians would define as the old covenant. And those who've been reading in their daily Bible reading went through Leviticus and Deuteronomy with us. And those books make me so thankful I didn't go to law school. Okay? You read those things and you're like, man, how did they keep track of if they were sinning or not? And someone, when we were studying Leviticus and Deuteronomy, walked into Bible class. I can't remember who it was. And they said, I am so thankful we are under the new covenant. To which we all said, amen. Because I think that's the lesson to learn when you realize it, because all of it was so overwhelming to keep up with. And so on Mount Sinai, to help illustrate this, Moses has this encounter with God, where God passes him by, where he just can kind of see his back. The closest living human has ever gotten to God. And he's literally glowing when he comes down from that experience. Think about when angels show up in the Bible. When angels show up in the Bible, for humans, it's a giant freak out moment, right? The humans are like, whoa! And the angels are always like, hey, don't be afraid. It's going to be all right. They got to calm them down. Right? See, the distance between the holy God and mortal humans is so great that it is difficult to reconcile the brokenness. But here's the good news for you. The good news this morning is that God noticed this. We're going to talk more about this next week, but that God sent Jesus precisely in the right moment for this. When Jesus came, the weight of all these Old Testament covenants were overwhelming. All the rules on top of it, all the things that were added, the huge taxes they were having to pay to even sacrifice to be right with God. On top of that, Roman oppression. This is why when Jesus goes on to deliver his greatest sermon of all time, he gives a blessing. Because there's all these people that have this feeling that you and I often have today. How can I ever be in relationship with this greater power than me? And Jesus gives them a blessing. He says, I'm going to help you out. This is why Jesus came to earth. Jesus came to earth to say what we describe as Christians as this new covenant, this covenant of atonement. In response to Jesus' actions, we all have a choice in life to make. We can repent of our sins. We can choose to follow Jesus into baptism, and more on this the last week in this series. But for now, the last question I want to ask you is a preventative question. How do we keep from getting in this mess in the first place? How do we avoid some of this pain, this sin in our life? What does sin prevention look like? And once again, the answer comes from archery. See, in archery, there's a condition called target panic. Okay, when you hold what we use to aim in archery are called pins. They're kind of like hash marks in a rifle scope. And you're holding that over the bullseye, and the temptation is to hold it there, and you're just with all your muscles trying to hold it. And then you pull the trigger, and you've been concentrating so much, you actually concentrated too much, and you're just trying to hit your mark, and instead you send an arrow to Jesus, okay? If you've been an archer there, you've done this before. So in archery, what do you do about this problem? Well, John Fell and I follow this guy called Joel Turner. Joel Turner is a police officer in Washington. He's on the SWAT team. He's a sniper in the police team. He is used to high-pressure shots. And the stuff that he teaches has nothing to do with your technique. It all has to do with what's going on in here and in here. And oddly enough, there's something you can do about this. See, when you hold as tightly as you can, it doesn't seem to work. But this is often our first instinct when we fight sin. We see the sin and we focus on that sin like it's the bullseye. And we're looking at it, we're flexing our muscles, and we're like, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to fight against it. And then eventually we get tired, we get nervous, and we get in our own heads, and what do? We fall for it. It's like the experiment they do where they put a cookie in front of a kid and they leave the room and they're like, don't eat the cookie, right? Eventually the kid eats the cookie. There's nothing they can do about this. And what is really interesting is when we do this, we aren't alone. The Apostle Paul, which if anyone should know something about it, describes it like this in Romans. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is written, it is no longer I myself who did it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but is the sin living in me that desires to do it. So there's a lot of I do's in there, right? And it gets a little confusing. It's like more I do's than a wedding ceremony. Okay, but you get this sense if you've ever gone through life and you're like, I know this is bad, but I'm still doing this. Like, why? Like, what am I thinking? We all have these Paul moments in life where we're just mad at ourselves. We're banging ourselves in the head. And Paul's saying that's our sinful nature coming out. So there's a better way. The solution is actually weirdly biblical. I told you about this guy, John Fellon. I follow Joel Turner. And the first part of his technique is not to be so focused on your sights, but to look through your sights, to look through your bullseye at what you're aiming for. And oftentimes, if we're just looking at the sin, trying to avoid the sin, we fall to the sin. But the answer is worship. When we are focused on God, when we are aiming at God, when that is our direction, then oftentimes we hit the mark. And it's incredible, this amazing feeling when you pull off this archery shot, you're looking at the target, you focused on it just correctly, you weren't so worried about just holding everything perfectly and it just goes through and you get a perfect bullseye. That's what happens when we worship. It actually sounds like this in Hebrews chapter 12. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Oddly enough, there is a more precise way to even learn from this because Joel Turner teaches this mantra that you are to say to yourself. That when you're anxious, when you're nervous, when you have this high pressure shot, you have to find a way to calm down your nerves and your adrenaline. It's called buck fever, where you just see something, you go crazy and you miss. So they say these mantras to themselves, and everyone comes up with their own meaningful mantra. But what's really interesting is all of them to me sound a whole lot like the Shema. Deuteronomy chapter 6 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength." Jesus says this is the first and greatest command, to love God with all of our being. So our focus, our mantra, the thing that truly calms us down and gives us peace is God. And so how do we do this? We do this through this word we call worship. What is our battle strategy through life? Well, when you read through the Old Testament and you see the battles that Israel won, when you see the things that people came through, you come to realize over and over and over again, the story repeats itself. It wasn't out of their own doing. It wasn't out of their own power. It was somehow God miraculously saved them. When they're standing at the edge of the Red Sea, when Pharaoh's army is crashing in, they cry out to Moses and they're like, "Have you led us here that we would die?" God responds in that moment and says, "You don't need to do anything. You just need to be still. And I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to work out." So what does it look like to be still? It looks like to worship God. Worship is a reset. It is a refocus. It is aligning the priorities in our hearts. So in times of celebration and thanksgiving, we worship. In times of despair and sorrow and grief and pain and hurt, we worship. And I hope that you notice something about this conversation today and what this conversation is not. Because in America, we love to have our worship wars because we have so much freedom here in worship. So we argue so much about goes into our hour or an hour and a half service every Sunday that we often totally miss the point. We argue about what songs we sing and how fast or how slow to sing them. We argue about if we're sitting, kneeling, standing, clapping, raising hands or not. Or, like our background and many other backgrounds, we talk about, well, what instruments can we use? Are we allowed to use instruments? Is a pitch pipe an instrument? Or maybe you saw the Church of Christ article in the Babylon Bee this week. If you saw that, you saw that guitars might not be okay, but according to the Church of Christ Grand Council, air guitars are all right. So I want to see you all rocking out there, okay? And if we aren't careful, our argument about Sunday worship time turns into an idol itself. It becomes the greatest thing on the list above worshiping God. And see, when these conversations are taking place, honestly, some of my least favorite conversations to have in the church setting, I'm always wondering, but what are we worshiping the rest of the week? What are we really worshiping in our lives? What's really going on with this? Because worship has always been so much more than the hour we gather together on Sunday. Yes, we need to gather corporately to worship, but we also need to be worshiping on our own. And you know what? You have more access to this than ever before in the history of the world. You can download and make a playlist of all your favorite Christian worship songs, and you can listen to them in the car, and you can listen to the Bible reading in your car. You can listen to sermons or Bible studies in the car, all those kind of things. You have incredible resources to be worshiping all the time, but we often settle for just an hour, hour and a half, depending on how long I preach every week. And you know, every now and then, occasionally, I hear someone describe someone. Man, they're such a good person. They go to church on Christmas and Easter, or they even take it up a notch. Man, they're a good person. They go to church every week. And I guess I'm jealous of those people. Because I need a lot more than just once a week to keep my loves in order. Okay? It takes a lot of work every day, a lot of dedication to make sure I am worshiping God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, with all of my being, and not worshiping all these other gods around me. So I hope you've come to see that the question that we're answering with this is not if we are worshiping. It's not the right question. The question we need to constantly be asking ourselves is, what am I worshiping? What is the God in my life? And is this life I'm leading a life of worship to the true God, or does it appear that there are some false gods harming me there today? So we've covered a lot of ground today. So I want to leave you with this. I want to leave you by asking you one simple question about worship. What can you not imagine life without? I mean, think about this. Maybe it's the mountains, maybe it's the snow, maybe it's the fish in the river, maybe it's something simpler like a shelter, a home, a safe place to have. Could you imagine life without ice cream? Do you realize Jesus didn't have any ice cream? Like, what a travesty. It wasn't even invented at that point. Or consider, could you not do without oxygen, family, and so on? You know, there's something special about a childlike faith. Last week, Silas's first grade class was asked this question. They had to write out on a huge poster board what they could not do without. And Silas and all of his friends wrote all these silly things. But I'm told that one of the kids, the first one in fact, wrote in big, bold letters 3 words. Let's look at it here. See if you can pick it out. 3 letters. God. They wrote God. And you know what this answer might be seen today is, oh man, that's so cheesy, that's so cliche. But you know what? If you spend some time worshiping other gods in your life, you realize what a profound truth this is. The thing we can't do without in life is God. And you know, it's really funny sometimes because we can get really worried that they're going to take God out of the schools or those kind of things. And I kind of smile and grin when we have those conversations because that's when God tends to do his best work. Okay? And so they can't take that out. They ask them this child goes up and writes this, and hanging right now in the hallways of Longfellow Elementary School in our town is a testament to who the true God is. If only we can have the eyes to see it. So my hope is that God is working on your heart today. That you'll leave here and have some conversations and some worship time with God about what gods you might be serving in your life. And wherever you're at in your faith journey, if you need someone to walk alongside you, if you need someone to help you turn from the idols and turn to the true God, know the elders and I are here to help you with this. We want to support you in this walk. We want to partner with you. But in the meantime, will you join me as we go to the one true God in prayer? God, we thank you for the course of human history walking beside us. Dealing with our sin, dealing with our brokenness, dealing with the hurts and the pains that we've caused in the world. And we thank you for being our God. So forgive us when we worship all the wrong gods, when we think that these other gods are giving us life. We don't recognize that really they're destroying us piece by piece. So instead today, we come to you as your people to make the commitment that we will have no other gods before you, that you are our first love, our true love, that you are our focus, that we are seeking to love you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We thank you for Jesus that makes all of this possible, for making this new covenant with us, for living this perfect life for us, for defeating death and sin for us. Thank you for Jesus, and it's in his name that I pray. And the church said, amen.